Crisis. The word means judgment. That's the literal translation from the Greek, where crisis means judgment. And judgment, in turn, means revelation. That's what happens with accurate judgments anyway. An accurate judgment reveals reality for what it is. And when we, as human beings, make accurate judgments about reality, that truth of reality shines forth. When we judge rightly that this is a shrub and this is a bush, reality as it is manifest. It's revealed. When we judge between animal and man, plant and animal, human and inhuman, good and evil, judgment reveals reality. Above all, we know this is the case with God's judgment, which has the power to reveal the truth of the human heart. A time of crisis, therefore, is a time in which the reality of our hearts are made manifest. And the time which we are in now is a time in which we should ask ourselves, what is this time showing us to be? What is it showing about our hearts? Specifically as Christians, what does it mean for us to be Christians in this time? Do we have a distinctive voice, or do we merely test the wind, like so many politicians and media personalities and sports league commissioners and other paragons of public morality? What does it mean for us to be Christians in this time? Well, Jesus in the gospel today draws quite the firm line in the sand when it comes to distinguishing between those who are his disciples and those who are not. You can hear his words once again, which are quite challenging. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Jesus is making it unmistakably clear that we cannot be his disciples if we place any other love in our lives before his love. His love must be the absolute priority of our lives. It cannot come second or third or fourth. It cannot merely be a part of our life. It has to be the whole into which our life fits. It has to be number one, or it is nothing. And Jesus isn't saying this just because he's an egomaniac or something, just because he wants all the attention for himself. No, the reason he's saying this is because he came into this world to reveal the absolute love. The love that measures all other loves. The love of the Father that goes to the very end for us. And the only way in which we can receive that absolute love is with a quite absolute response. We can't receive or respond to it with a half heart, without putting it at the very head, the very front of our lives. And therefore, if we love father or mother, son or daughter, anything else in preference to him, we're not really following him. Now, this, of course, doesn't mean that we're not to love father and mother, or son and daughter. Not that family love isn't a good thing. Jesus himself said he came not to abolish, but to fulfill the law, and the law says, honor your father and mother. And therefore, the church down through the ages has always upheld the virtue of piety, whereby we are to honor and respect those on whom we depend. But if we place these loves ahead of the love of God, then they become idols for us. And idols are always destructive at the end of the day. An idol where we place something created in the place of God always becomes destructive. I'm sure we can each examine our own experience and know how family love can be something that's distorted, that leads to possessiveness, jealousy, clingingness, disappointment, grudges, tribalism, all sorts of things that distort and can destroy our life because we place that love in the wrong place. No, the idol needs to be destroyed so that it can find its proper place and its true value underneath the love of God. It's true of so much in our lives. If we want to truly understand the value of the created things in our life, that needs to be placed under the love of God. We must reject the temptation to regard them as idols. And so throughout the history of the church, we can see that very often she has to first reject the idol, and then later she can incorporate the good into the love of God, the love of Christ. She had to reject pagan mythology, pagan idolatry, but later she could create space within herself for poetry, for statuary, for icons. She had to reject the pagan shrines and their architecture, but later she could incorporate that into her churches. We must die to the false life of sin, the false life of idolatry, in order to rise to the new life of the love of God. And this is something of what Jesus means when he says we must lose our life if we are to truly find it. Significantly for this time, that includes also the piety that we owe to our nation. Piety also extends to this notion of patriotism. It's the love and respect we owe to something on which we depend. But if that takes priority over God's love in our life, then it's in danger of becoming an idol, leading to nationalism and much potential destruction. Whereas if we assert God's love as primary in our life, then our legitimate patriotism, our legitimate love for our nation can find its proper place and measure. Loving Christ first, then, in our lives, and above all other things, gives us both the clarity and the courage to make the stand we're called to make as Christians, to give us a distinctive voice. And we need that courage, because history shows us to be a faithful Christian is to be exposed to attack from all sides. In this time, to be a Christian means to be exposed, to endure a double exposure, right? Because on the one hand, we're called to reject and oppose any nationalism that would so put the nation on the pedestal, pedestalize our nation, so as to preserve it from all critique, right? They would want to say, we can't examine our nation and see where it needs deep reform. They would want to say that the troubles we're dealing with aren't really things that should so much concern us, and which either by pointing the finger at others or saying that's all in the past would excuse ourselves from the work we need to do. No, the church says, no. Racism is a grave evil and a perennial temptation of the human heart, and it demands constant vigilance, especially in nations that have a history of it, especially after events like the one we endured earlier this month. We need to be humble enough to constantly return to examine ourselves, both on an individual and a collective basis, for how we can continue to oppose this evil, to purify and reform ourselves. We cannot hide ourselves in a false nationalism. And this opens up the Christian to attack from certain places. On the other hand, while we oppose that kind of nationalism, we also continue to affirm the virtue of patriotism, the virtue of the piety we owe to our nation. And therefore we oppose those forces in our culture now who are seeking to leverage the problem of racism to justify quite radical and revolutionary agendas. Agendas which in certain places are not fully in accord with the dignity of the human person, and which moreover would seek to cancel out any authentic patriotism, any love and respect and gratitude for our nation, which would seem to say that our sins are so grave that it overwhelms any positive in which we can be proud. And here again, the church says, no. We do owe gratitude for those on whom we depend. There's much that's noble and good in this nation and its history, in spite of its significant faults, in spite of its blotches, in spite of things that we continue to need to strive to reform. Nevertheless, there's something noble in the foundation of this nation that we need to honor and respect if we're to have any hope of authentic reform. And so here too, from the other side, as it were, the Christian who stands is exposed to attack. A double exposure. It's so easy to fall in with one crowd or another, one set of voices or another. Very hard to stand with Christ. And yet, if his love is the first priority in our lives, we can have the courage to stand with him. To be a Christian is to be willing to stand where few others are willing to stand. Because Jesus stood alone. He resisted all the false idolatries of his age. He refused to bow to the false absolutes that were presented to him, to the Roman authorities, to the Jewish authorities, to the cry of the mob. He resisted that sin all the way to the point of death, so that he could open up for us a new way of life, which is the world's only hope. A new way of life rooted in love of him above all other things. It's this Jesus who calls us to stand with him. This Jesus who was with George Floyd when he breathed his last breath. And the gospel tells us this Jesus who was also with Derek Chauvin in his prison cell. He calls us to stand with him, to die and to rise with him. And the question for us in this time of crisis, in this time of judgment, in this time of revelation, is, are we willing to follow him?